Hello. Today we will reveal one of the most astonishing and perhaps most shameful financial secrets of the 20th century. Have you ever wondered where the billions of dollars that the mighty Soviet Union accumulated for decades went? A country that officially despised Western currency was secretly hoarding it in vast quantities. But what happened to these immense riches when the USSR suddenly ceased to exist? Get ready to learn about scandalous currency sales, secret accounts in the world's most prestigious banks that even most of the Soviet leadership didn't know about. We will tell you how, in the last months of the state's existence, colossal sums simply evaporated, while millions of citizens stood in line for the most ordinary goods. You will learn about a mysterious group of just 5 people who had unlimited power over these immense assets. Their decisions determined the fate of billions. But who were they, and what happened to them? Gone is the era when the mighty Soviet Union, officially proclaiming the construction of socialism, rejected bourgeois currencies as hostile. But behind the facade of ideology lay a different reality. Western currency, whether dollars or francs, was as vital to the country as air. The shortage of goods within the country reached critical levels, and the only way to purchase them abroad was to pay in hard currency. The USSR constantly needed imports, from grain and equipment to medicines and clothing. In return, it could only sell raw materials, oil, gas, metals, and gold. However, world trade did not accept rubles, only dollars, marks, and francs. That is why the Soviet Union, finding itself in this paradoxical situation, accumulated Western currency to ensure its survival and purchase what it could not produce itself. As the country approached the end of the 80s, this dependence became more acute. The economy was faltering, there was a catastrophic shortage of currency, forcing the USSR to resort to extreme measures. A massive sale of gold reserves began, not little by little, but 50 to 60 tons each month. This colossal operation was carried out in the strictest secrecy from the people, but its scale was well known from the documents and reports of Western banks. By 1990, the USSR had accumulated more than $45 billion in foreign accounts, an amount comparable to the budgets of entire countries. And this at a time when the country's citizens sometimes could not find even soap and sugar in stores. For the authorities, this was a blatant paradox: poverty on the shelves and billions abroad. The USSR resembled a person with a safe full of dollars, but without the keys to it. This paradox was the result of deliberate actions. The currency was not just accumulated, but also carefully hidden. The money was kept away from prying eyes, not in the visible state bank, but abroad, under code numbers and through front organizations. Some of the reserves, of course, were located within the country, in the accounts of Neshekonom Bank, a kind of international wallet of the USSR. But a significant part, billions of dollars, was located abroad. It was these funds that proved most vulnerable at the time of the country's collapse. Soviet currency accounts were opened in banks in Austria, Switzerland, Germany, France, and even Japan, often not under the name USSR, but under fictitious names or numbers. This was done to cover tracks and hide the true owner. So-called code accounts meant that, for example, in a Swiss bank, the owner was not the country, but an abbreviation or just a number. Whoever had access to the password could manage millions. This scheme was used not only for trade operations, but also for financing intelligence, diplomatic missions, and sometimes for conducting secret deals. After the collapse of the USSR, a real hunt began for these accounts. But it turned out that most of the documents were lost. The people who had access either left or forgot the passwords. For example, frozen accounts worth more than $1 billion, once belonging to the USSR, were discovered in Japan and France. But it was impossible to unblock them due to the lack of official confirmation of ownership. Part of the reserves in Switzerland and Austria were kept under fictitious names, and who exactly controlled these accounts was never fully clarified. By the end of the 80s, a powerful management system was still in place on the surface of the Soviet Union. The government, party bodies, ministries. However, something completely different was happening behind the scenes. The management of currency reserves turned out to be concentrated in the hands of a narrow group of people whom no one elected and to whom no one obeyed. In 1990, the real decisions on how much currency to allocate for the purchase of grain, to pay off debt, or to help allied republics were made by only 5 people. These were representatives of Neshekonom Bank, the Central Committee of the CPSU, and the KGB. The government could officially only ask for money, but the final decision always remained with this group of five. These people had full access to billions in foreign accounts, and they determined who would get dollars and who would not. This was not openly discussed, documents were not published, reports were secret, but the facts indicate that control over the currency at the end of the USSR's existence was more like a shadow monopoly. At the same time, a secret directive allowed the KGB to spend currency without any verification. This money went to finance operations abroad, to encourage politicians, agents, and even support loyal groups in other countries. This later became known from declassified archives. Formally, everything looked strict and centralized, but in practice, different structures of the USSR were playing a parallel game with the same currency funds. Someone traded weapons, someone traded oil, someone conducted diplomatic negotiations, and the currency received could go into completely different pockets, and often irretrievably. When the USSR began to disintegrate, billions of dollars disappeared literally before our eyes. Chaos reigned in the country. The republics declared independence, laws ceased to be effective, and the old structures collapsed. In this confusion, the main value disappeared. The currency that had been accumulated abroad for decades. The financial system collapsed faster than the army or the party apparatus. Banks holding Soviet currency accounts continued to operate, but it was unclear who now had the right to dispose of this money. Some officials referred to Moscow, others to their republics, others simply remained silent and acted. It was at this moment that a massive transfer of funds abroad began, to private firms, offshore companies, and controlled structures. In just 3 months before the official collapse of the USSR, more than $13 billion disappeared. This money was transferred from external accounts, but no one still knows who did it and where it went. None of the former republics received these funds. The disappearance is shrouded in secrecy, and the documents are either destroyed or still classified. In 1992, when closed meetings were held between Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, the so-called Belovezhskaya Agreement, the agenda included not only the issue of dividing the country, but also the fate of the remaining currency reserves of the USSR. This was discussed in a narrow circle, without the participation of Parliament, without public statements, and even more so without the knowledge of the people. What looked particularly strange was that the currency reserves were divided not fairly, but according to the principle, whoever managed to get there first took it. Whoever had the codes and access to foreign accounts became the owner. Whoever did not was left with nothing. In some cases, money literally jumped from one account to another overnight. Such operations were disguised as commercial transactions or investments, but in fact, it was the withdrawal of assets accumulated by the entire country in favor of a narrow group of people. After the collapse of the USSR, a real race began. Who would be the first to reach the currency accounts abroad? Hundreds of accounts were left in limbo. The banks waited for someone to claim them. And that's when the most interesting thing began. Private individuals, new Russian banks, and offshore companies contacted the banks. Many of them acted on powers of attorney signed literally a couple of weeks before the end of the USSR. There were also those who came simply with an account number and access code, and that was enough to take millions. Thus, in 1993, $170 million disappeared from a Swiss bank, which belonged to the USSR and had been accumulated since the 70s. The bank still has not disclosed the name of the person who withdrew them. All that is known is that the operation was carried out according to the documents, and claims are no longer accepted. Particularly large sums were stored in Germany. More than $1 billion, which were previously used to pay for goods and technical contracts, were transferred to the accounts of companies associated with former Soviet officials. These companies were registered in Europe a few months before the collapse of the USSR and immediately began to develop the currency. It was during this period that the mass privatization of not only factories, but also foreign economic assets began. Many enterprises that had accounts abroad suddenly became joint stock companies and withdrew the currency to themselves. Some of this money remained in foreign accounts, but under new names. The schemes were worked out in advance. Companies were created abroad just before the collapse of the USSR in London, Cyprus, Switzerland. These firms were registered by former employees of Soviet financial and foreign trade structures. They were supposedly supposed to store or manage the currency, but in fact, they simply withdrew the money into private hands. In London, from 1991 to 1994, more than 200 firms were registered through which the currency flow from the USSR passed. These were legally clean schemes, an agreement between the firm and the bank, signatures, seals. Only there was no obligation to return the money to the state budget. One of the former heads of Neshekanam Bank bought a villa in Italy for $18 million, just a month after a large transfer from an old Soviet account. Officially, he explained this with personal savings. It was no longer possible to verify this. Some participants in these schemes later became major bankers, ministers, and even deputies. They legalized capital by investing it in Russian and foreign enterprises. Formally, there is nothing to complain about. Everything is drawn up according to the laws of the new time. But the origin of this money is from those same currency reserves of the USSR. A special role in these operations was played by the so-called financial intermediaries, companies that existed for only a couple of months and then ceased their activities. Tens of millions passed through them. Today, only lines in registration registers and rare traces in investigations remain of these firms. After it became clear that the currency reserves of the USSR were disappearing, Russia made attempts to return at least part of the lost funds. Negotiations began with foreign banks, appeals to the courts, work through diplomacy. But everything turned out to be much more complicated than it seemed at first glance. At first, the confusion interfered. It was unclear who now owned the Soviet money, Russia as the successor or the republics, which also claimed their share. While they argued, the accounts continued to be reset. Then there were legal difficulties. In many countries where Soviet money was stored, banks demanded proof of ownership, who has the right to withdraw these funds. There were few documents. Often there were simply no signatures, powers of attorney, or seals left. This was used by those who had prepared forged papers in advance or acted through their people. Russia still filed more than 10 lawsuits in international courts demanding the return of the currency that was officially registered to the USSR. But of all these cases, only one ended with a partial return of funds. The rest are either lost or have been hanging for decades. The most high-profile case occurred in 1994. Then, an account for $500 million belonging to the USSR was discovered in a bank in Geneva. The money had been on it since the 80s and had not been used by anyone. But when Russia tried to gain access, the bank refused. The reason? The client's card allegedly had an error in the date of birth, and therefore the bank cannot recognize the right of ownership. The money remained in the account, but access to it was lost. Some experts claim that billions of dollars are still hanging in different banks abroad. Simply no one can prove that they belonged to the USSR. This is because at the time of the country's collapse, financial affairs were conducted in the old-fashioned way. Some records were in paper archives. Some were in the memory of specific people. More than 30 years have passed since the end of the USSR, but the main question still remains unanswered. Where are all these billions? Part of it was withdrawn and settled in private hands, but according to experts, several tens of billions of dollars have simply disappeared, have not surfaced in cases, investigations, or reports. Some experts believe that the money of the USSR is still in closed accounts that were opened under code numbers. Access to them was only for a narrow circle of people. And while these people remain silent or have passed away, these funds are simply hanging motionless. A former KGB officer said in an interview with the Western press that a significant part of the Soviet currency was transferred to banks in Dubai to anonymous accounts only with a code. Such accounts existed in the 90s and exist now. No one touches the money there because no one can prove who it belongs to. This is such a stash for a rainy day, and perhaps someone is still waiting for the right moment to use them. There's also an even more alarming version. According to a number of investigations, about $7 billion belonging to the USSR ended up in the so-called red accounts system of the United States. These are accounts controlled by the CIA, which are used for secret operations and are not subject to official reporting. It is impossible to get access to them, especially if the money was transferred there anonymously. Some experts suggest that the United States and its allies simply froze the accounts while chaos reigned in the USSR and then used them in their own interests. After all, it is almost impossible to return what is not officially listed anywhere. It is also believed that some of the funds were directed to international trusts. funds through which you can conduct any operations without disclosing the real owner. It was such schemes that former officials and intelligence agencies often used to hide large sums from the press and investigators. The currency reserves of the USSR are not just missing billions. This is a story about how an entire country saved money for decades and then lost it in a matter of months. Accounts, code operations, offshore companies, front firms. All this was part of a grand scheme in which the people were irrelevant. The question of where this money is now remains open. Some was stolen, some hidden, some lies dead weight in other people's accounts. But the saddest thing is that no one has been held accountable, and perhaps these billions are still working, only now not for the country, but for those who planned it all.